There was a door in Hogwarts that punished force, laughed at cleverness, and answered every question with a sharper one. Everyone who found it before had tried to break it. Hermione Granger was the first to try to understand it. She found it because a tapestry had been hung wrong. 3 inches, no more, but 3 inches mattered when the embroidered border was meant to meet the stone molding exactly, and she noticed while returning a book on medieval wand woods to the library. She stopped, stepped back, narrowed her eyes at the row of lopsided golden griffins. "That is either very careless," she murmured, "or very deliberate." Since Hogwarts rarely did anything carelessly for longer than a century, she set her books down. The tapestry showed Hengist of Woodcroft, presenting a silver cup to a witch, whose face had faded almost entirely from the cloth. She pressed the nearest griffin, tugged the lower corner, tried a revealing charm, and nothing happened, except that Hengist's cup turned briefly transparent to display 3 embroidered cherries inside it. The border came next. She traced the stitched Latin letters with one finger, reading under her breath, and found the phrase claimed that wisdom entered where pride had already gone. The sort of solemn nonsense, she thought, that people carve above doors after deciding plain instructions lack dignity. Lifting the tapestry from the left rather than the right revealed a narrow strip of stone, no handle, no keyhole, no visible hinge, only a shallow, circular depression at shoulder height. She studied it without touching. Around the circle the stone was faintly polished, as though many hands had pressed there before hers, and the lower edge bore a dark brown mark that looked suspiciously like old scorching. "So," she said, glancing along the empty corridor, "someone did touch it." She placed the tip of her wand into the depression and cast Alohomora. The spell sank in with a soft click, traveled around the circle, and came back to her wand in a sharp blue spark that made her jerk her hand away. The tapestry rustled, though there was no draft, and Hengist's silver cup tipped towards her in what might have been reproach. That was not an attempt to force anything, she told the wall. That was a perfectly standard diagnostic spell. Beneath a film of dust, the circle brightened. Fine lines appeared in the stone, each no wider than a strand of hair, arranging themselves into a spiral of tiny letters, and she leaned close enough that the tip of her nose nearly touched them. The script was cramped, angular, much older than the tapestry that had hidden it. She recognized several abbreviated runic forms from early British ward-making, though whoever had carved them had possessed a particularly irritating fondness for leaving out vowels. Her books stayed on the floor for the next 20 minutes. She copied the visible inscription onto the back of an essay draft, compared the repeated symbols, spoke possible translations aloud. "Entry is granted to the hand that bears no hand," she read at last, then frowned. "No, that cannot be right." 2 marks adjusted, she tried again and got, "The door yields to the touch that does not touch," grammatically sound and considerably less helpful. Testing the wording seemed safer than testing the ward. She levitated a loose thread from the tapestry and guided it towards the depression. The moment it crossed the final inch, it curled into a glowing red hook and vanished with a tiny hiss. A scrap of parchment went next and folded itself neatly into the shape of a hand, slapped her wand aside, and fell smoking to the floor. She stared at it. "That," she said, was unnecessary. Crouching to examine the parchment hand, she found its edges warm but not burnt, and a new line of writing in black ink across the center. "Touch is the first failure," it declared in severe capitals. Beneath the sentence, a smaller row of symbols had appeared, curling like sparks around the paper thumb. Her mouth lifted before she could stop it. A ward that answered experiments was far more interesting than one that merely repelled them. By the time she stood, the forgotten library book had slid open on the floor, and Hengist of Woodcroft had resumed presenting his cup to no one in particular. She gathered up the parchment hand, her notes, the book, and glanced once more at the hidden circle. "You punish contact, distinguish intention, transform foreign material, and communicate in 2 written systems," she said, which is rather a lot of showing off for a door. The fine letters glimmered once, and somewhere beyond the wall, something gave a quiet metallic chime. She came back after supper, armed with a canvas satchel, 3 library books, a brass thermometer, 2 pairs of dragonhide gloves, and the expression she generally wore when expecting an object to become reasonable under sustained attention. The corridor was empty apart from a suit of armor propped against the opposite wall, visor lowered. She laid her equipment in a straight line beneath the tapestry, checked both ends of the passage, and lifted the cloth. Dull and innocent, the circular depression waited in the stone. "We shall begin," she said, "by establishing exactly what you consider touching. Air first." She conjured a narrow current and directed it towards the circle, keeping the flow steady enough to stir dust without disturbing the tapestry. The depression stayed dark until the current reached its center, whereupon a thread of orange light spun into existence and followed the air back towards her wand. She cut the charm at once. The light vanished, leaving behind the smell of singed rosemary, though there was no rosemary anywhere nearby. "That suggests you recognize directed force," she said, writing rapidly, "or magical intention carried through a medium." She tried again with an ordinary breath blowing across the circle from 2 feet away, and nothing happened but a loose strand of hair falling across her face. A stronger breath did the same. She tucked the hair behind one ear with a small, satisfied nod. Natural movement allowed, deliberately shaped, magical movement rejected. Then the thermometer. She levitated it close to the stone without letting it cross the final inch, watching the red line climb from 17 degrees to 30 to 42, then stop. The circle itself showed no flame, yet the air just before it was warm enough to heat metal, and when she moved the thermometer sideways, the temperature dropped sharply beyond the circle's edge. The heat formed a perfect cylinder, extending outward from the depression, as precise as a diagram in a textbook. Behind her, the suit of armor gave a faint creak. She glanced over her shoulder and found the visor raised by half an inch. "You may watch," she told it, "provided you do not fall on anything." The visor lowered again with what sounded like disappointment, and she turned back to the wall to draw a careful cross-section of the invisible boundary, marking distance, temperature, response. A hidden entrance ought to have been less pleased with itself. The arrangement had elegance all the same. The gloves proved less useful. She set one on the floor, animated its fingers, ordered it to press the depression. It rose obediently, marched up the stone like a large brown spider, and stopped just short of the circle. Its index finger bent backwards. Then the whole glove turned, pointed accusingly at her, and slapped itself flat against the wall. She canceled the animation before it could develop further opinions. "Indirect control is still control," she said, adding another line to her notes. The second glove she pushed forward with a non-magical wooden rod held in a levitation charm, which she considered a meaningful distinction. The ward did not. A narrow tongue of flame flicked out, ran along the rod without consuming it, and tapped the end of her wand. Heat flashed across her knuckles. She dropped the spell and sucked in a sharp breath, more offended than hurt. The skin was pink but unblistered, and the warmth faded almost at once. Along the wooden rod, black letters appeared one after another as though written by an invisible quill. "Distance does not make a hand innocent." For several seconds she only stared. Then she set the rod down with exaggerated care. "That is an argument," she said. "A rather smug one, but still an argument." The suit of armor creaked again, and this time its gauntlets clapped together once before going perfectly still. Hermione looked at it until its helmet bowed. Her first theory had been the tidy one, that the inscription described a method of entry, some harmless form of contact the ward would accept the moment she named it correctly. The experiments disagreed with her. Air, objects, animation, levitation, mechanical pressure. Each was judged by intention rather than by physical means. What the ward measured was not touch at all, but responsibility. Hermione drew a line through half a page of notes, pressing hard enough to tear the parchment. Crossing out work always galled her. It looked untidy, and worse, it confessed that the work had gone nowhere. But facts remained facts, even when they had arranged themselves to be as irritating as possible. So she gathered the gloves and the thermometer and left the marked rod propped against the wall as evidence. Before she lowered the tapestry, she leaned in towards the circle. "Very well. Touch is not the mechanism." The stone brightened from within. Around the depression, a ring of pale flame appeared, silent and perfectly round, each tongue bending inward, as though it were listening. At the center, a single line of runes assembled itself in the air, and Hermione had translated them before the last symbol settled. "What, then, is a door for?" She read the question 3 times, though its meaning did not improve with repetition. The runes hung in the hollow of the flame, steady as ink laid on invisible glass. "A door is for permitting or preventing passage," she said at last. The words had barely left her when the pale fire rose a good 6 inches. A hot breath brushed her face, and the answer was gone. "That was correct," she informed it. "Broad, perhaps, but unquestionably correct." The circle offered no sign of agreement. She opened one of her books to a chapter on architectural enchantments and ran a finger down the index, where doors had served as boundaries, tests, traps, symbols of hospitality, declarations of ownership, and, in one unpleasant Welsh manner, instruments for correcting pronunciation. Her second answer had more edges to it. A door exists to regulate passage between 2 spaces according to conditions set by its maker. The flame narrowed into a bright white ring, and for one promising second She thought she had satisfied it. Then every loose page in her satchel turned itself over at once, showing her nothing but blank backs. A line of English crawled across the nearest sheet. "That is what a lock is for." Her lips pressed together. Opposite her, the suit of armor shifted 1 foot, and the scrape it produced sounded remarkably like suppressed laughter. "A lock may be part of a door," she said, addressing Ward and armor alike. "But the distinction is unnecessarily pedantic." The fire pulsed once. "Though technically defensible," she added. She copied the question onto fresh parchment and drew a box around it. "What, then, is a door for?" The phrasing mattered. It had not asked what a door did or why one was built or how one functioned. Someone had chosen the simplest possible form of the question, perhaps because simple questions are so often the easiest places to hide an assumption. "A door is for opening," she wrote, and beneath it, closing, entering, leaving, dividing, joining, choosing, delaying, welcoming, excluding. The list spread across 2 columns before long. Several answers were too obvious and several too abstract, and one concerning draft prevention was plainly beneath the dignity of a centuries-old enchantment, though she refused to strike it out until she had tested the grammar. "For opening," she said. The flames bent outward like petals, and darkness stood revealed behind them. She took an involuntary step forward. The opening lasted only an instant before it snapped shut in a burst of gold sparks that showered harmlessly across her robes, and a new sentence burned itself into the air. "Then why are so many kept closed?" "Because people are forever hiding things behind them," she replied, before she could think better of it. The fire gave a low crackle that might have been amusement, though attributing moods to defensive enchantments was methodologically unsound, and she knew it. "For entering," she tried, and the ward asked why doors had 2 sides. "For leaving," and it asked whether a prison door served the prisoner or the jailer. When she offered "for choosing whether to cross," the response came sharper. "Who chooses?" Every answer was accepted just long enough to be examined, then handed back with a question lodged neatly inside it. By the 6th attempt, she had stopped consulting the books altogether. She sat cross-legged on the flagstones with parchment fanned out around her and her wand tucked behind one ear, watching the thing that was no longer behaving like a password ward at all. Passwords accepted or rejected. They did not object to definitions or expose ambiguity or demand that the speaker account for somebody else's point of view. "This is a sequence," she murmured. "You aren't asking for the final answer at all." Her quill hovered over the page. Perhaps each reply was meant to reveal the next question, the true destination waiting at the end of a chain of ever more exact definitions. Ancient magical logic sometimes ran that way, especially in monastic wards, where entry was granted only after a formal disputation. Give Hermione a structure to apply, and her confidence returned quickly. She set the ward's questions in order and marked how the subject shifted beneath them. Function, closure, direction, authority. A door is for establishing a crossing whose use depends upon the will of those on either side, she said, pleased with the balance of the thing. It belongs neither wholly to the person entering nor wholly to the person barring entry. The ring blazed scarlet. Flame rushed along the floor in 2 thin streams and circled her scattered notes without so much as scorching them. Every page lifted, folded itself sharply down the middle, and stood upright like a row of tiny closed doors. On the wall, the runes rearranged themselves into one severe sentence. A door has no will. She stared at the paper doors ringing her in. Her elegant sequence of definitions had collapsed under a single line. Reaching for her quill, she found it still behind her ear and let a breath out through her nose. "Fine," she said. "That was wrong." One of the folded pages opened by itself. Inside, in a small hand she did not recognize, were 4 words. "Why did you answer me?" Hermione did not answer at once. The 4 words sat within the folded parchment with the quiet confidence of a question that already knew she had made a mistake. All around her the other paper doors stayed upright, each closed along its crisp central crease, and the ring of flame had settled back to gold. "Because you asked," she said finally. Every folded page opened. The movement traveled around her in a neat circle, one after another, until the floor lay covered in flattened parchment. No new words came. The fire neither rose nor dimmed, and she let several seconds of silence pass before she added, "And because the question appeared to be part of the ward." For that she earned a shower of tiny blue sparks, which landed on the nearest page and arranged themselves into a question mark. Her first instinct was to call the response unhelpful. Instead, she looked again at the words. "Why did you answer me?" It was the pronoun that snagged her. Until now, she had thought of the enchantment as a mechanism shaped by its maker. However sophisticated its replies, mechanisms did not, as a rule, refer to themselves. Without crossing the invisible boundary, she moved closer and studied how the flame behaved. Individual tongues rose and curled in repeating patterns, yet no 2 ever completed quite the same motion. Variation too structured to be random, too fluid to pass for runic notation. When she shifted her weight, the flames nearest her leaned by a fraction, like heads turning towards a speaker. "Now, you understand context," she said. "You distinguish a literal answer from an explanation, and you alter your response according to what has already been said." The ring brightened modestly. "That does not make you conscious," she went on, less certain now. "Portraits do much the same thing, and most of them are only impressions." From the tapestry, Hengist of Woodcroft cleared his embroidered throat. She glanced up. "I said most." The silver cup in his stitched hands tilted until the 3 cherries rolled from one side to the other. Hermione watched them go, then turned back to the fire. A portrait could answer because it had been taught the habits and memories and manner of one particular person. A ward could answer because its creator had anticipated a range of replies. The question was whether this flame was working through a very large set of instructions or doing something less easily catalogued. She gathered the paper doors and stacked them at her side. On the top sheet she wrote, "Hypothesis 2, Progressive Verbal Test." Then after a pause beneath it, "Probably wrong." The admission looked offensive in her own handwriting, but leaving it unwritten would not improve the evidence. "Were you made to ask questions?" she said. The fire narrowed to a point at the top of the circle, then split it into 2 even arcs. A line of red letters surfaced in the gap between them. "Were you?" Hermione's eyebrows climbed. "That is evasion." "Is it?" "Yes." She folded her arms. A question used in place of an answer is still evasion, even when it happens to be relevant. The letters went out, and for a moment nothing came to take their place. Then the flames sank so low that the dark center of the ring seemed to widen, and a different sentence assembled itself near the floor. You have done it 7 times. She glanced down at her notes. It was true. She had answered questions with questions 7 times since finding the passage, though she had never troubled to keep a tally. 4 had been requests for clarification, 2 had challenged the ward's assumptions, and 1 had come out of her mouth the instant the parchment slapped her wand aside. That was different. I was investigating. Oh, so am I. The laugh got out before she could stop it. A small sound she buried at once beneath a cough, and the suit of armor lifted its visor again. She ignored it. Being handed her own method back with that much precision made annoyance difficult to sustain. She sat again, closer to the ring this time, and set her notes down between them like a tutor opening a lesson. Very well. Suppose I accept that your questions are not merely obstacles. What are you investigating? The flames drew inward until they were a single, slender circle, no thicker than the stroke of a quill. Somewhere beyond the wall, a soft, metallic chime sounded. 1 note became 2, then 3, each clearer than the last. At the center of the fire, slowly, the answer took shape. The person who thinks I am a door. Hermione read it until the letters dissolved back into flame. The person who thinks I am a door. Annoyingly exact. She had found a concealed passage, uncovered a circular ward in the wall, and taken it for granted that whatever stood before her was there to keep her out. The scorch marks had encouraged the idea. So had the failed spells, the hidden mechanism, the chime beyond the stone. And yet a row of tidy assumptions did not add up to a single fact. She pulled a fresh sheet towards her and wrote, "What have I actually observed?" Underneath she listed the circle, the heat, the responses, the transformed objects, the questions, the sound behind the wall. Nowhere in it was there proof that the stone opened, that a corridor ran on behind it, or that passing through the flame was even what she was meant to do. Across from her, the armor creaked. Its visor had risen once more, though only far enough to show darkness inside. "You knew I was wrong, did you?" The helmet nodded, then shook itself slowly, which she took to mean either no, or that suits of armor made unreliable witnesses. She turned back to the circle. "What are you?" Sharply the fire contracted. Its inner edge went smooth, not a single tongue of it wavering, and a phrase stood at the center. War. "What are you?" That has become a habit. She thought of answering with her name, but names were labels, and the ward had shown little patience with labels. "I am a student," she tried instead. The flames leaned left, then right, weighing the word and finding it badly balanced. A second line formed beneath the first. "When you are not studying?" She opened her mouth, shut it, looked down at the parchment. "I am still a student," she said with rather less conviction. In reply, the ward produced a tiny flame in the shape of a book. It opened, snapped closed, and vanished in a puff of copper sparks. "Very amusing." Her quill tapped against her knee. "I am a witch, a daughter, a friend." The last word came after a small pause, and the ring warmed from gold to amber. Nothing challenged it, but the wall did not move either. True enough, all of it, and every word of it, a category. She could already hear Professor McGonagall asking what quality the categories had in common, and Professor Snape inquiring whether she intended to spend the whole lesson reciting nouns. She rubbed a smudge of ash from her cuff. I am the person asking questions. At the top of the circle, a narrow gap opened. Hermione leaned in. There was no darkness through it, no hidden corridor, no chamber, only more flame. Ring behind ring, red and blue and violet and white, laid in delicate circles behind the first. They receded into the stone farther than the wall could possibly hold, each turning at its own speed. Then the gap closed before she could study them. She kept very still, quill hanging over the page. The circle was not covering an entrance. It held something, or stood for something, or reached into a space whose dimensions had no intention of agreeing with the corridor. Excitement tightened her grip until the feather bowed. Again. Show me that again. The ward did nothing at all. She waited, then repeated the answer that had opened the gap. I am the person asking questions. The flames stayed perfectly round. She tried the sentence with a different stress, changed the final word, planted her feet in exactly the spot she had stood in before. Nothing shifted. You are checking whether I understood it, she said slowly. Repeating the phrase is not enough because the phrase was never the answer. A pale spark ran once around the circle and her eyes narrowed with pleasure. On the parchment she drew several concentric rings and labeled each by color, motion, apparent depth. Statements moved the outer fire, but the inner structure had shown itself only when her description of herself turned from a category into an act. Perhaps the ward did not ask what things were at all. Perhaps it asked what they were doing in the moment they replied. Aside went the list of definitions. At present, she said carefully, I am observing you, testing what you distinguish, and attempting to correct a mistaken model. The gold flames parted halfway down both sides. Behind them, the nested rings turned in silence, and at their center floated something small and dark. A seed held inside a lantern. Before she could settle whether it was an object or simply an absence, words appeared across the innermost white fire. Then stop naming me. The command hung over the white fire while she stared at the labels on her parchment. Door, ward, enchantment, test, mechanism. Every useful thought she had managed began by dropping the flame into a category and then measuring its behavior against the rules of that category. The method had carried her through nearly every lesson she had ever sat, which made the objection feel almost like a personal insult. Names are useful, she said. The outer ring flared once. She frowned. They allow distinctions. Without distinctions, observation goes muddled, and muddled observation breeds dreadful conclusions. Behind the gold, the violet circle quickened, though the others held their measured pace. Calling you a door was wrong because you do not behave as a door behaves. Calling you a ward may be too broad. Calling you an interactive magical construct is accurate but ugly. A war. A small tongue of fire came out of the circle and wrote a single word on the air. Is it? She leaned back on her hands. Accurate or ugly? The word split neatly in two. Both. Then we agree. She reached for her quill, caught herself in the act of writing interactive magical construct once more, and stopped. The feather hovered. She put it down instead. For several minutes she watched and set nothing down. The outer flame rose and folded inward. The red ring behind it moved clockwise, the blue counterclockwise, and the narrow white circle at the center held still. Until she looked away, at which point it had somehow shifted. Heat pooled close to the stone without spreading down the corridor. The dark seed at the center never moved. Watching without naming turned out to be far harder than she had expected. Her mind supplied the words before she could head them off. Circle, rotation, heat, depth, seed, even color was a category, and she found herself growing cross with the basic machinery of her own thinking. "This is absurd," she muttered. "One cannot examine anything without thinking something about it." The fire gave her no answer. She got up and paced the width of the passage, and the armor turned its helmet to follow her, careful this time not to creak. Hengist of Woodcroft had given up on his silver cup and was pretending to admire the faded witch beside him. 3 times she passed the hidden circle before she stopped so abruptly that her shoe squeaked on the flagstone. "Stop naming you," she said. "Not stop thinking." A line of green fire opened along the lower edge of the ring. Hermione came forward again, slowly. Objection, she reasoned aloud, was to conclusions placed before observation, not to description itself, and as she said it, the green line climbed a little higher. She could report what happened without deciding what the thing was. Her wand rose and then sank before she cast. Magic introduced intention too quickly. So instead she held one palm near the ring, stopping well outside the heated boundary, and chose her words with as much precision as she could manage. When she moved closer, she said, the flames nearest her bent inward. When she spoke, the red circle slowed. When she made a claim about the ward's purpose, the gold rose. When she asked a question, the white ring became visible. The nested flames answered one by one, each altering exactly as she described. Her breathing quickened. A step to the left, and the blue fire followed. A step right, and the violet ring widened while the red drew in. None of it behaved like the blunt reflex of a defensive spell. The changes were linked. The pattern was not yet clear. She tried another description. When I admit uncertainty, more of you becomes visible. The outer flame parted by several inches. The layered circles opened before her, bright and intricate, the dark central object hanging beyond them. Larger now, or perhaps merely nearer, its surface gave nothing back. Around it moved a thread of silver sparks, so fine she could only catch them by keeping her gaze slightly to one side. Delight pushed a smile onto her face. "There you are." The fire snapped shut. Heat struck her sleeve hard enough to make her flinch back, and a thin black line appeared across the cuff of her robe, though the cloth stayed whole. On the wall the letters burned with unusual sharpness. You named what you had not reached. Her smile went out. That was an expression. It was a claim. Rubbing the scorched line between finger and thumb, she studied it. The ward had tolerated errors before. This response was stronger. It did not punish ignorance. It punished certainty used carelessly. Stubbornness tempted her for a moment to argue that ordinary speech could not be held to the standards of formal proof. And then she remembered the parchment hand, the marked rod, and every earlier answer that had failed because she had assumed the ward meant something simpler than it did. "Fair," she said at last. "Annoying, but fair." The black mark faded from her cuff. In its place, a tiny silver question mark stitched itself into the fabric. She turned the sleeve towards the light and gave a quiet huff. "You are enjoying this?" No words came. The outer flame bent inward, and somewhere among the turning rings, there was the unmistakable sound of a page being turned. It came again, soft and dry, from somewhere inside the wall. Hermione held still and listened. Not quite parchment, though it carried the same delicate scrape, and it repeated only when the innermost white ring completed a turn. "A sequence," she murmured, then glanced at the silver question mark on her cuff. "That is a description before you object." Nothing answered. She fetched her notes and began sorting them by what had changed rather than by what she had attempted. Questions revealed the white ring. Uncertainty opened the outer flame. Definitions provoked resistance. Descriptions altered the colored circles in consistent ways, and careless certainty produced heat. Set side by side, the reaction stopped resembling a set of riddles waiting on correct replies. They looked more like instructions taught through consequence, each rebuke, stripping one bad habit from the exchange. Force, distance, assumption, repetition, labels, certainty. She wrote the 6 in a column and stared until the first letters started to look meaningful, then struck the thought out before it could become another pattern she'd invented. "You are teaching a method?" she said. The gold flame held steady. She leaned closer. That was a claim, wasn't it? No heat came, and she waited, and still none came. "You did not object, because the claim follows from the observations, or because you want me to continue?" The blue ring widened by the thickness of a thread. "That is thoroughly unfair," she said, though her voice had brightened. "You are making me distinguish evidence from encouragement." She sat again, folding one leg beneath her. The puzzle had shifted from an exam into something more like a conversation with a professor who refused to correct an answer outright. Professor Flitwick taught that way now and then, though he usually provided biscuits and did not scorch sleeves. The comparison was useful, she decided, and probably best kept to herself. At the center, the dark shape stayed visible only in glimpses. Every time she tried to fix on it, the outer ring narrowed, as though attention aimed at the prize disrupted the process. Deliberate that too, most likely. Whatever waited within could not be reached by treating each step as nothing more than a way of getting closer to it. She closed her eyes. Without sight, the heat grew easier to measure. It pressed evenly against her face, then shifted faintly whenever she moved her hands or changed her breathing. A page-turning sound went on at regular intervals, and under it she caught a second rhythm. 3 soft crackles, a pause, then 2. Her eyes opened and she counted the rotations. Red turned 3 times to blues 2. Violet moved once for every 5 red turns, and white shifted only after the others aligned. "Ratios," she whispered. "You are coordinated." The flames brightened. Again she drew the circles, this time naming no colors, marking each only by direction and speed. A pattern surfaced after several minutes. The alignments happened whenever one of her statements matched an observable change exactly. When she exaggerated or guessed or slid from description into interpretation, the rotations fell out of step. She tested it carefully. The nearest ring is warmer at the top than at the bottom. The circles staggered, and a spark struck her parchment beside the sentence. The thermometer, when she checked, showed the temperature perfectly even. "Wrong," she said, drawing a line through it, and the rings realigned. The second visible ring slows when I lower my voice. "Nothing changed." She repeated it more quietly, and still nothing changed. "Also wrong," she admitted, crossing it out. The white ring moved. A pleased little sound escaped her, so the ward was not rewarding correct guesses alone. It responded when she recognized an error without dressing it up as something else. Turning back through her earlier notes, she found the same pattern in places she'd mistaken for silence or irritation. "What matters is correction," she said, then caught herself. "No. What I can observe is that you become more ordered when I identify an unsupported statement and withdraw it." All 5 circles aligned. For one breath, the ring of fire went perfectly still, the flames neither flickering nor bending, the layered colors forming a clear tunnel through the stone. At its center floated the dark object, near enough now to show a fine golden line around its edge. Then the alignment broke, the fire took up its turning again, and across the center a new question appeared. "Which answer do you trust most?" She glanced at the pages around her, crowded with revisions, scorched corners, arrows, and marginal notes that had grown steadily more impatient. "The one that survives testing," she said. The fire rose. She frowned, already hearing the flaw. "No, survival may only mean I have not tested it properly." The flames dropped at once, and the page-turning sound became a clear metallic click. Hermione looked up sharply. It had come from within the layered fire, precise and mechanical, like a catch releasing somewhere inside a clock. The colored circles kept turning, but their motion had changed. Each now paused for the smallest fraction of a second as it crossed the top of the ring. She listened through 3 complete cycles before she spoke. "You altered after I corrected the answer." A thin silver spark traveled around the outer edge. She bent over her notes. The ward had asked which answer she trusted most. Her first reply had appealed to endurance under testing, and she had withdrawn it because an answer could endure only through insufficient examination. That correction had produced the click, which suggested the important act had never been choosing an answer at all, but naming the weakness in the standard by which she meant to trust it. "The answer I trust most," she said slowly, "is the one I remain willing to question." The gold flames surged towards her. Hermione threw up an arm as heat rolled across the corridor, lifting the edges of every parchment sheet, though none caught. When the ring settled, a red line appeared in the air. "Then you trust the question more." She lowered her arm and stared at the sentence. "No," she said, "that does not follow." The flame tightened. A question can be badly formed, misleading, or built on a false assumption. To trust questions simply because they are questions would be idiotic. She reached for her quill and wrote the words beneath the ward's challenge, the ink catching on a rough patch of parchment. "I trust neither automatically. I examine both." The inner rings slowed. Rising, Hermione moved closer. The heat held steady now and no longer pushed her back. "An answer deserves confidence in proportion to the quality of its evidence and the care of its reasoning. A question deserves attention according to whether it exposes something useful." She looked at the central darkness and finished quietly. neither receives obedience. At that, the red sentence broke apart into sparks, and for a moment, the passage filled with the sound of many pages turning at once. It came from beyond the flames, from a depth that had no business fitting inside the wall, and it carried the faint smell of old paper and warm brass. Her fingers tightened around the quill. The question had been another trap, not a cruel one, though. It invited her to swap certainty in answers for reverence towards questions, which was the same mistake dressed up more attractively. Submission to a different rule was not what the ward wanted. It wanted her to examine the rule itself. "You are testing habits of thought," she said, and the outer circle divided into two arcs. She waited for a rebuke that never came. The opening stayed narrow but stable, and through it she saw the nested rings aligned around the dark central shape. This time she resisted the urge to name what she saw and described only the visible facts. There is an object at the center. It has a continuous, curved edge. A gold line follows that edge and does not rotate with the surrounding circles. The opening widened, and within the darkness a surface appeared, black, polished, no larger than a galleon. That gold line had not been painted on. It shone from a seam around the rim. Her mind supplied several possibilities at once: locket, lens, seal, miniature box, enchanted medallion, and she let each one pass without choosing. "Its purpose is unknown," she said aloud. The white ring brightened until it was almost colorless. Another sentence formed, or, "What would make you worthy of it?" Her mouth tightened. That is a dreadful question. Worthy according to whom? By what standard? Worthy to possess it, inspect it, use it, or merely reach it? She began to pace again, though from thought now rather than irritation. And why assume worthiness is relevant at all? The layered rings accelerated. Hermione stopped. "There it is," she said softly. "The false assumption." The flames folded inward, opening a clear path towards the center, and warm air brushed her face with a faint scent of metal and dust. Beyond the corridor of fire, the black object waited, motionless and bright-edged. She did not reach for it. Instead, she held her hands behind her back. "I do not know whether I am worthy. I do know the question gives me no usable definition of worth, and I will not invent one simply because the object is beautiful." The fire collapsed into silence. Every circle vanished but the innermost white one, which floated alone in the stone surrounding the dark object. Across its center, a final line appeared. "Good. Now ask better." Hermione lowered herself to the floor once more and drew a clean sheet of parchment from the bottom of the stack. Perfectly still, the white ring hovered before her with the dark object held inside it. "Ask better." She wrote the words at the top of the page and underlined them once. Her first question came quickly. "What is the object?" The ring did nothing. She waited, tapping the quill against her thumb, then crossed the sentence out. It asked for a label before she understood the conditions under which the object mattered. "What does the object do?" She tried. A hair-thin line of flame appeared across the center and split the dark disk into two equal halves. Nothing else moved. She watched it, then shook her head. "Still too early. Function depends on context, and I have not established whether it acts independently, responds to a user, or merely records something." The line vanished. Beneath a second column headed Useful Unknowns, she wrote origin, purpose, method, limits, risks, ownership, relation to the fire. Sensible enough, but it also looked exactly like the opening of a library research plan, and the ward had not spent hours correcting her assumptions only to reward a better organized set of ordinary questions. "What do I need to know before approaching it?" she asked. The white ring expanded by an inch. She sat straighter. "Better," she murmured. The phrasing put the uncertainty where it belonged with her own knowledge, and stopped short of claiming the approach was either safe or intended. Even so, it assumed that approaching the object was the correct next step. She crossed out approaching and wrote, continuing in its place. "What do I need to know before continuing?" The ring expanded again, its light spreading across the wall to reveal fine marks in the stone beyond it. Not scorch marks, not carved runes, but hundreds of shallow lines, as though generations of quills had tried to write on the rock and failed. A new question surfaced beneath hers. "What have you not tested?" Hermione considered the corridor. She had tested contact, distance, magical intention, physical proxies, definitions, descriptions, questions, corrections, and the ward's responses to uncertainty. Her notes covered nearly everything she had done. Then she noticed the one constant she had treated as too obvious to examine. "Myself?" she said. The ring dimmed but did not close. She frowned at her own answer. It sounded dramatic, which made her suspicious. She had tested her reasoning again and again, and the ward had drawn attention to her habits often enough. "No," she corrected. "I have tested my conclusions. I have not tested whether the responses depend on me specifically." The white fire brightened. She stood and called softly down the corridor. No one answered. After a moment's hesitation, she pointed her wand towards the suit of armor. "Would you care to assist?" The armor's visor snapped shut. That was not a threat. She waited. "I only need you to stand nearer the circle." One stiff step, then another, joints clicking with theatrical reluctance. The suit reached the edge of the invisible heat, and the white ring stayed exactly as it was. She had it raise a gauntlet, tilt its helmet, knock twice upon its breastplate. Not one of the movements produced the smallest response. "Thank you," she said, and the armor bowed so deeply and retreated so quickly that one shoulder struck the wall. Next, she set her wand on the floor and stepped back. The ring dimmed as the distance between them grew, and brightened when she returned. It followed her, not the wand. Speaking from behind the tapestry, out of sight, she found the fire answered her questions just as before. Finally, she left the corridor altogether, counted slowly to 10 around the corner, and came back. The white ring had gone. Hermione halted beneath the edge of the tapestry. The moment she crossed into view of the circular depression, the flame returned. Faint first, then clear, and the dark object reappeared within it, precisely where it had been. "You remember the exchange?" she said. "You distinguished the participant, not merely the voice or the magic." Words formed in the white fire. "Do you?" She blinked. "Do I what?" The question rearranged itself. "Distinguish the participant?" Her gaze moved over the scorched rod, the parchment hand, the silent armor, the silver question mark stitched into her cuff. All evening she'd spoken of the flame as though it were a single thing, yet its responses had come through heat, writing, motion, sound, transformation, and the nested rings, parts of one enchantment perhaps, or several systems cooperating. She approached until the warmth touched her cheeks. How many of you are answering me? The white circle shivered, and for the first time the dark object opened. The dark disk separated along its golden seam. Its two halves neither swung outward nor slid apart. One surface folded through the other with the smooth impossibility of a card being turned inside out. A shallow cavity appeared at the center, holding 3 points of light, one red, one blue, one white. Hermione moved half a step nearer. The outer flame raised no objection. Each point brightened in turn, and each change brought a different answer from the corridor. Warmth from the red, a faint chime from the blue, letters forming in the white. 3 systems, she said, or 3 functions. The red point flared. Heat pressed against her forehead, not painfully, but firmly enough to make her reconsider. 3 observable functions, she amended, and the pressure vanished at once. She took up her quill and split the page into 3 columns. Under red, she wrote consequence, boundary, physical response. Blue got sequence, timing, memory, though she set a question mark beside memory. Language, challenge, correction. The white point had handled all 3, but calling that intelligence felt premature. "Do you answer together?" she asked. All 3 lights brightened at precisely the same instant. Then the red dimmed, the blue chimed twice, and the white wrote, "No." Hermione stared at the contradiction. That was one question. "Yes," wrote the white light. She tried again, asked of all 3, and the blue point chimed once. Her eyes moved from one color to the next. The white answers language, the blue marks relation or order, the red enforces the result. Heat touched her cheek, neither approval nor rejection, and she narrowed the statement. "Those are the roles I have observed so far." All 3 lights steadied. The discovery pleased her enough that she had to resist writing excellent in the margin. What she'd taken for one clever enchantment was a conversation among several parts, and the inconsistencies were no longer inconsistencies at all. One component could reject a statement while another acknowledged its relevance, and a third could alter the conditions in response. She started sorting the earlier events by color. Scarlet blaze had followed unsupported certainty. Blue sparks had marked incomplete distinctions. White fire had appeared around questions, and the metallic clicks had accompanied successful corrections. Even the parchment hand made more sense now. Red had stopped the intrusion, white had supplied the sentence, blue had preserved the exchange. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked, and the blue point began to chime. 3 slow notes, a pause, then 7, then 12. She wrote the sequence down and waited. The pattern repeated, but this time the final group came out at 11. "That is not a date. You are counting something that changes." "Attempts," wrote the white point. Hermione's quill stopped. 3, 7, 12, 11. The blue sounded the sequence again, and now she noticed that the pauses differed. The first interval longest, the second shorter, the third almost absent. She drew the rhythm beneath the numbers and saw the structure. "Categories," she murmured. 3 who reached the questions, 7 who reached the flame, 12 who found the wall. The final 11 troubled her until she looked at the scorched marks around the depression, and one who found it, but did not try. The red light warmed. She glanced towards the faded witch in the tapestry. The stitched figure's face had nearly vanished, yet one hand remained visible beneath Hengist's silver cup, raised but away from the door, rather than towards it. "Someone understood enough to leave?" Hermione said. "Why?" The white point formed. She looked back at the open disc. The answer seemed obvious at first. Fear, caution, failure, lack of curiosity. But each possibility carried more invention than evidence, and she sat quietly until the temptation to choose one had passed. "I do not know," she said, "and I cannot learn it from scorch marks." A single clear, low chime from the blue. Then the red light withdrew into the disk, the blue following, and the white was left alone. A new circle of flame formed around it, smaller than before, bright as polished silver, and across its center appeared a sentence she had not yet seen. "The flame is not the question." She read it once, then again. Behind the words, the white point pulsed in time with her breathing. Her gaze moved from the disk to the ring, from the ring to the notes spread around her, and at last to the silver question mark sewn into her cuff. "No," she said softly. "I am." The silver ring held steady while she considered what she had said. "I am." It sounded embarrassingly theatrical when she repeated it in her head, yet the enchantment had not rejected it. The white point went on pulsing with her breath, brightening on each inhale, softening on each exhale. She tested the connection by holding her breath. The point stayed bright for 2 seconds, then dimmed. When she breathed out, it flashed sharply enough to cast a thin shadow behind every thread in the tapestry. "So you are measuring attention," Hermione said, "or participation, possibly both." The ring narrowed. Too broad. She pressed 2 fingers to her wrist and counted her pulse while watching the light. The rhythms did not match, and the point did not respond when she deliberately quickened her breathing either, which ruled out a simple bodily link. Next, she closed her eyes and recited the 12 principal uses of moonstone in potion making. The white point faded almost at once. She opened her eyes, returned her attention to the flame, and it brightened again. "That is clearer. You follow whether I am attending to the exchange." The silver ring expanded. She wrote the observation down, then added a second line. "It responds to the quality of attention, not merely presence." The wording pleased her until the ring contracted. Frowning, she read the sentence again. "Quality is a judgment," she admitted. "What I observed is only the divided attention weakens the response." The ring reopened. At last, a pattern was emerging that did not need to be forced into place. The enchantment distinguished between contact and intention, names and descriptions, answers and corrections, presence and engagement. It did not reward cleverness in the abstract. It responded to how thought was being used. She turned through her pages. The earlier questions had seemed aimed at the nature of doors, identity, trust, worthiness, yet each had exposed the same tendency to answer before examining the shape of the question. The flame had burned higher whenever she treated the puzzle as an object to defeat, and opened whenever she let the exchange change her method. "You are not asking me to solve you," she said. The silver ring remained still. she corrected herself. What I can support is that progress has not depended upon reaching a hidden answer. It has depended upon noticing how I answer. The white point divided into 3 smaller lights, one moving left, one right, one holding at the center, and between them appeared a line of writing. What will you ask now? She looked at the dark disk, the nested rings, the concealed depth inside the wall. There were dozens of attractive questions. Who had made the enchantment? What lay beyond it? Why had it waited so long? Each would satisfy curiosity, and none addressed the condition immediately before her. She folded her hands in her lap. What assumption am I making by wanting to continue? The 3 lights stopped moving. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the central point turned gold, the other 2 dissolving into it, and a warm line traveled around the silver ring without heat or threat. She thought the question through aloud. I am assuming there is a farther point to reach. I am assuming the object is meant to be opened, entered, taken, or understood more completely. She glanced at the notes surrounding her. I am also assuming that because the enchantment has continued responding, it wants me to proceed. The ring gave a soft, metallic chime. That last assumption is the weakest, she said. Response is not invitation. The gold light brightened. Hermione stayed where she was. Every earlier visitor, judging by the scorch marks, had tried to cross, seize, unlock, dispel, or overpower the fire. Even she had spent hours treating each opening as permission to move closer. Perhaps the puzzle ended only when someone proved capable of stopping, before desire became entitlement. She laid her wand on the floor beside the quill. I will not approach the object unless the conditions are made clear. The flame parted. This time no corridor opened through layered fire. The whole circle unfolded sideways, each ring widening into a broad arc until the wall behind it became visible. A shallow chamber emerged from the stone, no deeper than a cupboard lined with dark blue tiles. At its center rested the black disc, open like a tiny box. Inside lay no jewel, key, or weapon, only a folded square of parchment, yellow with age, and a brass instrument shaped like a compass with 7 needles. Hermione did not touch either. The gold light hovered above them, waiting. Across the open disc, the enchantment wrote its clearest question yet. Hermione studied the parchment and the brass instrument without stepping any closer. Beneath its glass face rested 7 needles, each pointing a different way despite the compass lying perfectly flat. No seal marked the folded parchment, no signature, no visible title. Before taking one, she said, I would need to know whether either belongs to someone, whether removal would damage the enchantment, and whether taking is actually required. Once, the gold light circled the 2 objects. No words appeared. She glanced at the open chamber and amended her answer. I would also need to know what taking means here. Possession, temporary examination, or merely lifting an object from its place? One of the 7 needles turned towards her. That is a response, she said. It is not yet an answer. It held while the other 6 drifted slowly beneath the glass. Crouching outside the chamber, she examined the base of the instrument, where tiny runes had been engraved around the rim, several of them hidden by shadow. She raised her wand, hesitated, and cast Lumos without directing the beam into the chamber so that reflected light reached the brass indirectly. The gold flame stayed calm. Illumination, it seemed, was permitted so long as it carried no force across the boundary. One mark at a time, the inscription became legible, and she translated it under her breath. One points towards what is hidden, one towards what is lost, one towards what is sought, one towards what is feared, one towards what is needed, one towards what is remembered, and one, she leaned closer, one towards what is falsely believed to be absent. The seventh needle trembled. Delighted despite herself, Hermione sat back. That is marvelous. She followed each needle with her eyes, trying to work out which description belonged to which movement. None bore labels, and their metals differed only slightly. Brass, copper, silver, iron, tin, gold, and something blue-gray she did not recognize. By comparison, the folded parchment looked plain, which made it immediately suspicious. She considered a revealing charm, then remembered how the first spark had returned through her wand. I need to know whether examination counts as taking, she said. The gold light moved over the parchment and paused. A line appeared across the chamber tiles. You have been examining both. Fair point. She looked again at the objects, careful not to extend a hand. That earlier question had offered a choice. Before taking one, it had not asked which she wanted or which was more valuable or which she deserved. Perhaps the puzzle turned on recognizing that either object could be approached responsibly once the right uncertainties were addressed. May either object be removed without harm to the chamber or to its function? She asked. The gold light divided, one half hovering above the parchment, the other above the compass. The same word appeared above both. Yes. Do they belong to a living person? No. Were they placed here to be used by whoever completes this exchange? The flame flickered, and her hand shot up at once. No, that assumes completion grants permission. She thought again. Were they placed here with conditions governing their use? Yes. The parchment unfolded by itself. Its inner surface was covered with neat brown writing, faded at the edges but still readable. No grand declaration, only a list of rules. The compass could be borrowed, but must be returned before the borrower next slept. It must never be used to locate a person without that person's knowledge. It would point according to the holder's understanding, meaning careless questions produced dangerously persuasive directions. She read the final rule twice. The instrument does not reveal truth. It reveals the direction implied by the question. The gold needle swung towards the folded tapestry behind her. That is why it has 7 needles. Each one answers a different kind of absence, and the user must know which absence they have asked about. She frowned at the compass with deep appreciation. A person looking for what they feared would find something very different from what they needed. The white flame returned around the chamber's edge. A final note waited at the bottom of the parchment. The borrower was instructed to write one question they had learned to ask more carefully, then leave the page for the next person. Beneath the rule were lines in dozens of hands, some elegant, some blotched, some no more than a few uncertain words. She read only the first 3 before stopping. They felt private despite their age. Out came her quill, though she did not yet reach for the parchment. May I add to it without borrowing the compass? The flame parted from the threshold, and Hermione leaned into the chamber at last. Warmth moved around her hands without touching them as she lifted the parchment onto her knee. After a long pause, she wrote, "What evidence would change my mind?" The 7 needles aligned. For one remarkable second, all 7 pointed directly towards her written question, their metal tips touching at the center of the compass to form a tiny 7-pointed star beneath the glass. The gold light above the chamber deepened to amber, and the ring of white flame withdrew from the threshold. No hidden mechanism clicked. No stone door swung wide. The enchantment simply ceased to stand between her and the objects. Hermione rested the parchment carefully beside the compass. "That is permission, I think," she said. The flame gave no answer, which was entirely appropriate. Permission clearly stated did not require applause. She reached in and set 2 fingers against the brass rim. Warmer than the surrounding stone and much heavier than its size suggested. As she lifted it, 6 needles scattered at once, while the 7th stayed fixed upon the tapestry behind her. She turned the instrument slowly, but the needle went on pointing the same way. "Which one are you?" she murmured. At close range, the metals were easier to tell apart. That steady needle was blue-gray, marked near its base with the rune she had translated as falsely believed to be absent. She looked over her shoulder. The faded witch in the tapestry stood beside Hengist of Woodcroft, one hand still raised away from the hidden circle, and the needle pointed directly at her. Hengist watched with embroidered suspicion and drew his silver cup closer to his chest. Keeping the compass level, Hermione approached the cloth. "I am not interested in your cherries," she told him. The faded witch did not move. Towards the lower edge of the figure's sleeve, the needle guided her to where the stitching had thinned almost to bare canvas. She examined the threads, first by reflected wand light, and then through a small magnifying lens from her satchel. Beneath the faded blue wool lay a line of silver embroidery so fine that it vanished whenever viewed straight on. She shifted sideways. Letters appeared. She read them in silence, then once aloud. "Nothing guarded here is lost. It waits wherever the question is still being asked." It sounded like the sort of inscription she would normally distrust on principle, but the compass needle did not point towards the words. It pointed lower to the witch's embroidered hand, where between 2 fingers sat a tiny stitched ring of gold. Hermione touched the tapestry lightly. Though it had appeared to be no more than part of the picture, the ring loosened from the thread and dropped into her palm, smaller than an ordinary finger ring and made of warm brass, with 7 shallow grooves around its edge. When she held it near the compass, each needle settled into one groove. The instrument opened without a hinge. Its glass face lifted like a clear bubble, and the needles rose into the air, carrying the little brass ring between them, turned once slowly, then cast 7 narrow beams across the corridor. Where the beams touched stone, lines of pale gold appeared, tracing the outlines of blocked stairways, forgotten cupboards, sealed arches, and passages folded behind other passages. A delicate map of Hogwarts spread across the walls, not as rooms and corridors alone, but as questions left unresolved by the castle itself. Hermione forgot to breathe. One line vanished whenever she tried to follow it too quickly. Another appeared only when she looked at the empty space beside it. Several ended in small circles of flame, like the one she had found, while others dissolved into symbols she had never seen in any book. Behind her, the white fire gathered once more around the hidden chamber. It rose without heat, folded inward, and became a perfect ring, no larger than a saucer. The brass compass settled into its place. The parchment folded itself beside it, and the 7 beams withdrew from the walls. Hermione handed the little ring back to the witch's waiting fingers, and the embroidery drew shut around it. Silver threads folding over gold until nothing showed but a faint curve. Hengist went on presenting his cup as before, though now, unless she imagined it, he watched her from the corner of one stitched eye. She lowered the tapestry with some care, aligning each griffin against the stone molding. Just before the hidden circle vanished, its flame split into 2 graceful arcs. There she stood, ash on her cuffs, a silver question mark sewn into one sleeve. 3 fresh pages of notes tucked under her arm. Behind the cloth, the fire drew itself into a perfect golden ring, and for a moment its light shone clean through the weave, wrapping the faded witch's hand like a small captured sunrise. Hermione filed the whole affair away in the careful, delighted manner she kept for problems that had beaten everyone before her. She told no one, not because it was secret, but because explaining it properly would have taken far longer than anyone was willing to sit still for. Some doors, she had decided, were far more interesting left as questions.